Margaret Williams adjusted her reading glasses as she settled into seat 2A of the first-class cabin. At 72 years old, she had earned every comfort this VIP seat provided. The soft leather embraced her tired shoulders as she prepared for the 5-hour flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles. She was traveling to surprise her son Marcus on his 50th birthday, something she had been planning for months. Margaret had worked 3 jobs for most of her adult life to put Marcus through college. She cleaned office buildings at night, worked as a seamstress during the day, and took care of elderly neighbors on weekends. Every penny she saved went toward Marcus's education and dreams. Now, decades later, her son had become the CEO of Williams Tech Solutions, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. The flight attendant, a young woman named Jessica with perfectly styled blonde hair, approached Margaret with a forced smile. Behind her stood a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit, looking impatient and entitled. His face was red with frustration, and he kept checking his gold watch every few seconds. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jessica said, her voice carrying a tone that made Margaret immediately uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation here. This gentleman is Mr. Richard Blackstone, and he's a very important business executive. He has an urgent meeting in Los Angeles, and he really needs this seat." Margaret looked up from her book, confusion crossing her weathered face. She had paid full price for this ticket, just like any other passenger. Her confirmation email clearly showed seat 2A, and she had checked in online 12 hours earlier. "I'm sorry, dear, but I don't understand," Margaret said politely. "This is my assigned seat. I have my boarding pass right here." She reached into her purse and pulled out the crumpled paper, showing the flight attendant her seat assignment. Mr. Blackstone stepped forward, his voice loud enough for other passengers to hear. "Look, lady, I fly this airline every week. I spend over $200,000 a year with them. I'm sure they can find you another seat somewhere else on the plane." Jessica nodded eagerly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "We'd be happy to move you to a lovely seat in coach. It's really quite comfortable, and we'll make sure you get extra peanuts and a free beverage." Margaret felt her heart sink. She recognized this situation all too well. Throughout her 72 years, she had faced countless moments like this, people assuming she didn't belong in certain places, that she couldn't afford nice things, that she should step aside for others who they deemed more deserving. "Young lady," Margaret said, her voice steady but firm, "I paid for this seat just like everyone else. I made my reservation 2 months ago, and I have every right to sit here." Other passengers began to notice the commotion. Some turned in their seats to watch, while others pretended not to see what was happening. A few looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke up to defend Margaret. Mr. Blackstone's face grew even redder. "Do you know who I am? I could buy and sell you 10 times over. Just take the other seat and stop making this difficult for everyone." Jessica seemed to gain confidence from Blackstone's aggressive tone. "Ma'am, we really need you to cooperate here. Mr. Blackstone is a platinum member, and we have to take care of our most valued customers. I'm sure you understand." Margaret understood perfectly. She understood that despite paying the same money for the same seat, she was being treated differently because of the color of her skin. She understood that these people saw an elderly black woman and assumed she was less important, less deserving, less valuable than the angry white man standing beside her. "I will not be moving from my seat," Margaret said clearly. "I have done nothing wrong, and I have every right to be here." The flight attendant's fake smile disappeared entirely. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to involve security. I really don't want to do that, but you're holding up the entire flight." Margaret looked around the cabin. She saw other passengers watching the scene unfold, most of them looking away when she made eye contact. She felt alone, just as she had felt so many times throughout her life when facing discrimination and prejudice. But Margaret Williams was not a woman who gave up easily. She had raised a successful son as a single mother, worked multiple jobs for decades, and overcome obstacles that would have broken weaker people. She was not about to let some entitled businessman and a discriminatory flight attendant intimidate her. "Call security if you want," she said calmly. "I know my rights, and I'm not moving." Jessica whispered something to Mr. Blackstone, who nodded aggressively. She then walked to the front of the plane and picked up the phone to speak with the captain. Margaret could see her gesturing wildly as she explained the situation. Meanwhile, Mr. Blackstone stood next to Margaret's seat, making loud comments designed to embarrass her. "Some people just don't know their place," he said to another passenger. "They think they can cause trouble and hold up everyone else's plans." Margaret ignored his comments and continued reading her book, though her hands were slightly shaking from the stress of the situation. She thought about her son Marcus, wondering what he would say if he knew what was happening to her right now. After a few minutes, Jessica returned with the head flight attendant, a stern-looking woman named Patricia who appeared to be in her 50s. Patricia had obviously been briefed on the situation because she approached Margaret with an already disapproving expression. "Ma'am, I understand you're refusing to change seats," Patricia said coldly. "I need to inform you that disrupting a flight is a federal offense. If you continue to be uncooperative, we'll have no choice but to remove you from this aircraft." Margaret looked up at both flight attendants and then at Mr. Blackstone, who was smirking with satisfaction. She realized that this situation was escalating beyond a simple seat dispute. These people were prepared to have her arrested rather than tell a white passenger that he couldn't have someone else's paid seat. "I am not disrupting anything," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. "I am sitting in the seat I paid for, reading my book quietly. The only disruption here is from people who think they can bully an elderly woman into giving up what rightfully belongs to her." Patricia's face hardened even more. "Ma'am, we've offered you alternative accommodations and you've refused. We have other passengers to consider, and we cannot allow one person to hold up this entire flight." "Then perhaps you should tell this gentleman that he cannot have my seat," Margaret replied. "Problem solved." Mr. Blackstone exploded at this suggestion. "This is ridiculous. I have a meeting worth millions of dollars waiting for me in Los Angeles. I cannot sit in some cramped coach seat for 5 hours. My back problems require the extra leg room of first class." Margaret almost laughed at the irony. "I'm 72 years old with arthritis in both knees, and I also need this leg room. The difference is that I paid for it instead of demanding that someone else give up theirs." The situation had now attracted the attention of every passenger in first class. Some were recording the incident on their phones, while others whispered among themselves about what was happening. The energy in the cabin had become tense and uncomfortable. Patricia made a decision that would soon change everything. "Ma'am, I'm calling security to escort you off this plane. You have 5 minutes to gather your belongings and exit voluntarily, or you will be removed." Margaret felt a wave of humiliation wash over her, but she also felt something else: determination. She reached into her purse and pulled out her cell phone. If these people wanted to escalate this situation, she was prepared to make some calls of her own. "Before you do that," she said, dialing a number, "I think there's someone you should speak with." Patricia rolled her eyes. "Ma'am, calling your family members is not going to change this situation. We have procedures to follow." Margaret smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "Oh, I'm not calling a family member. I'm calling my son's office. You see, Marcus Williams is the CEO of Williams Tech Solutions, and his company handles all the technology systems for this airline. I think he might be very interested to know how his mother is being treated on one of your flights." The phone rang twice before a professional voice answered. "Williams Tech Solutions, CEO's office. This is Sarah speaking." "Hello, Sarah. This is Mrs. Williams. Is my son available? I'm having a little problem that I think he needs to know about." Patricia and Jessica exchanged worried glances. Mr. Blackstone, however, remained defiant. "I don't care if your son is the President of the United States. I need this seat. and I'm not taking no for an answer." Margaret ignored him and continued speaking into her phone. "Marcus, honey, I'm sorry to bother you at work, but I'm sitting on one of Skyline Airlines' planes right now, and they're threatening to have me arrested because I won't give up my first-class seat to a white passenger." Even through the phone, Margaret could hear her son's voice rise in anger. The other passengers couldn't hear his words, but his tone was unmistakable. Margaret listened for a moment, then looked directly at Patricia. "My son would like to speak with whoever is in charge of this situation," she said, holding out her phone. Patricia hesitated, suddenly looking less confident than she had moments before. She took the phone reluctantly and put it to her ear. "Hello, this is Patricia Matthews, head flight attendant," she said. What happened next would be talked about in aviation circles for years to come. Margaret watched as Patricia's face went from confident to concerned to completely terrified in the span of about 30 seconds. The other woman kept saying, "Yes, sir," and "I understand, sir," while her hands began to shake. After about 2 minutes, Patricia handed the phone back to Margaret with trembling fingers. Her face had gone completely white, and beads of sweat had formed on her forehead. "Mrs. Williams," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to call the captain immediately." Margaret took her phone back and spoke briefly with her son, assuring him that she was fine and that the situation seemed to be resolving itself. She could hear him making other phone calls in the background, his voice stern and businesslike. Mr. Blackstone, who had been listening to this entire exchange, was beginning to look worried for the first time. "Who exactly is this woman's son?" he asked Jessica quietly. Before anyone could answer, Patricia returned from the cockpit with the captain himself, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, who appeared extremely concerned. Behind them came 2 security officers, but Margaret noticed they weren't approaching her. Instead, they positioned themselves near Mr. Blackstone. The captain approached Margaret's seat and spoke in a respectful, almost apologetic tone. "Mrs. Williams, I am Captain Rodriguez, and I want to personally apologize for this situation. I've just spoken with our corporate headquarters, and they've instructed me to ensure that you receive the absolute best treatment for the remainder of your flight." He then turned to Patricia and Jessica, his expression stern and professional. "Ladies, I need to see both of you in the cockpit immediately. We have some very serious matters to discuss." Both flight attendants looked terrified as they followed the captain toward the front of the plane. Margaret could see them through the curtain, engaged in what appeared to be a very heated conversation with the captain and someone on the phone. Mr. Blackstone was still standing in the aisle, looking increasingly uncomfortable as other passengers stared at him. He seemed to realize that his aggressive behavior had been witnessed by everyone in first class, and that several people had recorded the entire incident on their phones. "Look, maybe we can work something out," he said to Margaret, his tone much less demanding than before. "I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding here." Margaret looked at him with the patience of someone who had dealt with bullies her entire life. "The only misunderstanding, sir, is your belief that you're entitled to something that belongs to someone else simply because you think you're more important than they are." One of the security officers approached Mr. Blackstone. "Sir, we're going to need you to return to your assigned seat. There seems to have been some confusion about the seating arrangements." "But I was told that this seat would be available," Blackstone protested. "The flight attendant said she would take care of it." The security officer's expression was firm. "Sir, every passenger is entitled to the seat they paid for. No exceptions. Please return to your assigned seat, or we'll have to escort you off the aircraft." As Mr. Blackstone reluctantly walked toward the back of the plane, Margaret could hear other passengers whispering about what had just transpired. Some were expressing outrage at how she had been treated, while others seemed amazed at how quickly the situation had been resolved once she made her phone call. A young black woman sitting across the aisle leaned over and spoke quietly to Margaret. "Ma'am, I want to thank you for standing up for yourself. I was recording everything that happened, and I plan to share it with everyone I know. What they did to you was completely wrong." Margaret smiled at the young woman. "Honey, I've been standing up for myself for 72 years. I wasn't about to stop today." As the plane prepared for takeoff, Margaret reflected on what had just occurred. She thought about all the times throughout her life when she had faced similar discrimination, but hadn't had the resources or connections to fight back effectively. She thought about other elderly passengers, other people of color, other vulnerable individuals who might face similar treatment and not have a son in a position to help them. The flight attendant who replaced Jessica came by to offer Margaret anything she needed for the flight. She was professional, courteous, and seemed genuinely concerned about Margaret's comfort. It was a stark contrast to the treatment she had received just minutes earlier. Margaret accepted a glass of water and returned to her book, but her mind kept wandering to the bigger implications of what had just happened. She knew that her son's phone call had saved her from being humiliated and possibly arrested, but she also knew that the airline's quick response had more to do with protecting their business relationship than with doing the right thing. As the plane climbed into the sky, Margaret Williams had no idea that her decision to stand up for herself that day would lead to changes that went far beyond her individual situation. The consequences of this flight were just beginning, and they would reach much further than anyone on that plane could have imagined. Marcus Williams ended the call with his mother and immediately turned to his assistant Sarah with an expression she had never seen before. His usually calm demeanor had been replaced by controlled fury that made the entire office feel different. As the CEO of Williams Tech Solutions, Marcus had built his reputation on being level-headed and professional. But what he had just heard on that phone call had pushed him beyond his normal limits. "Sarah, I need you to get me David Chen from Skyline Airlines on the phone right now," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that made his assistant spring into action immediately. "And after that, I want a conference call with our entire legal team." David Chen was the chief technology officer at Skyline Airlines and had been working with Marcus's company for the past 3 years. Their business relationship was worth over $50 million annually, with Williams Tech Solutions providing all of Skyline's passenger management systems, booking platforms, and customer data analytics. While Sarah worked to connect the calls, Marcus walked to his office window and looked out at the Atlanta skyline. His mind raced back to his childhood, remembering all the sacrifices his mother had made for him. He thought about the nights she came home exhausted from working multiple jobs, her hands rough from cleaning office buildings, but still finding time to help him with his homework and encourage his dreams. Margaret Williams had never asked for much from life. She had raised Marcus as a single mother after his father left when he was 8 years old. She worked as a seamstress in a factory during the day, cleaned offices at night, and took care of elderly neighbors on weekends to make extra money. Every penny she earned went toward Marcus's education and future. When Marcus graduated from MIT with degrees in computer science and business, his mother was the proudest person in the graduation ceremony. She had saved for months to buy a new dress for that day, and Marcus still remembered how beautiful she looked despite all the hardships she had endured. Now, 30 years later, Marcus had built a technology empire that employed over 5,000 people and generated billions in revenue. But none of his success meant anything if he couldn't protect the woman who had made it all possible. "Mr. Williams, I have David Chen on line 1, Sarah announced through the intercom. Marcus picked up the phone, his voice professional but cold. "David, we need to talk about what just happened to my mother on one of your flights." David Chen sounded confused and concerned. "Marcus, I'm not sure what you're referring to. What happened to Mrs. Williams?" Marcus explained the situation in detail, describing how his mother had been threatened with arrest for refusing to give up her paid first-class seat to a white passenger. As he spoke, He could hear David's intake of breath and the sound of papers shuffling as the CTO took notes. "Marcus, I am absolutely horrified by what you're telling me," David said. "This is completely against everything our company stands for. I need to investigate this immediately and get back to you with answers." "David, I appreciate your response, but this goes beyond just an investigation," Marcus replied. "My mother was humiliated and threatened on your aircraft by your employees. They were prepared to have a 72-year-old woman arrested rather than tell an entitled passenger that he couldn't have someone else's seat." David was quiet for a moment, understanding the gravity of the situation. Williams Tech Solutions wasn't just any vendor to Skyline Airlines. They were the backbone of the airline's entire technology infrastructure. Every booking, every customer interaction, every operational system depended on Marcus's company. "What can we do to make this right?" David asked carefully. Marcus had been thinking about this question since he hung up with his mother. "David, this isn't about my mother getting special treatment because of who her son is. This is about your company having policies and employees that discriminate against passengers based on their race. How many other elderly black passengers have been treated this way when they didn't have a son who could make a phone call?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David knew that Marcus was right. If this situation had happened to any other passenger, the outcome would likely have been very different. "I want a full investigation into this incident," Marcus continued. "I want to know how your employees were trained to handle these situations. And I want to know what policies allowed them to think this behavior was acceptable." While Marcus was speaking with David Chen, his legal team was already gathering in the conference room. His head of legal affairs, Janet Rodriguez, had been with the company for 8 years and had never seen Marcus this personally invested in any business matter. After ending the call with David, Marcus joined his legal team to discuss their options. The room was filled with some of the best attorneys in the country, all of whom specialized in different aspects of corporate law. "Janet, I want to understand exactly what legal recourse my mother has in this situation," Marcus began. "But more importantly, I want to know what leverage we have to ensure that Skyline Airlines makes real changes to prevent this from happening to other passengers." Janet consulted her notes from the preliminary research her team had already conducted. "Marcus, your mother has strong grounds for a discrimination lawsuit under federal civil rights laws. The fact that this incident was witnessed by multiple passengers and likely recorded on cell phones gives us solid evidence. But here's what might be even more powerful," added James Morrison, the company's contracts attorney. "Our service agreement with Skyline Airlines includes specific clauses about corporate values and ethical conduct. If we can demonstrate that their discriminatory practices violate these clauses, we have grounds to terminate our contract immediately." Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. Terminating the contract with Skyline Airlines would cost his company millions in revenue, but it would also cripple the airline's operations. Without Williams Tech Solutions, Skyline wouldn't be able to process bookings, manage passenger data, or operate their customer service systems. "How long would it take them to replace our systems?" Marcus asked. "At minimum, 18 months, replied Susan Kim, their technology integration specialist. "And that's assuming they could find another vendor willing to take on a project this complex. Most companies wouldn't want to inherit the liability of switching systems for a major airline." As the legal team continued their analysis, Marcus received a call from his mother. She was still on the plane but wanted to update him on what was happening. "Marcus, honey, they've been treating me like royalty since you made your phone call," Margaret said. "The captain himself came to apologize, and they've moved that rude man to a seat in the back of the plane." "Mom, I'm glad you're being treated better, but this isn't over," Marcus replied. "What happened to you was wrong, and I'm not going to let it slide just because they're being nice to you now." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She understood her son's anger, but she also knew the weight of the responsibility he was carrying. "Marcus, I don't want you to jeopardize your business over this. I'm fine, and I can handle whatever comes my way. Mom, you shouldn't have to handle discrimination and prejudice at 72 years old, Marcus said firmly, and you definitely shouldn't have to handle it alone. I have the resources to fight this, and I'm going to use them. After speaking with his mother, Marcus returned to the legal team meeting. By now, they had developed a comprehensive strategy that went beyond just seeking compensation for his mother's treatment. Here's what I want, Marcus announced to the room. I want Skyline Airlines to implement mandatory sensitivity training for all employees. I want them to establish clear policies that protect passengers from discrimination. I want an independent review of their complaint procedures, and I want them to create a victims' compensation fund for other passengers who have faced similar treatment. Janet looked up from her notes. Marcus, those are significant demands. They're going to cost Skyline millions of dollars to implement. Good, Marcus replied. Maybe that will motivate them to take this seriously. And if they refuse, we terminate our contract and explain publicly why we can no longer do business with a company that discriminates against its passengers. While Marcus was planning his response, word of the incident was already spreading throughout the airline industry. Several passengers on the flight had posted videos of the confrontation on social media, and the story was beginning to gain traction online. David Chen called Marcus back within 2 hours with preliminary findings from Skyline's internal investigation. What he reported made Marcus even more angry than he had been initially. Marcus, I've spoken with the flight crew and reviewed our training procedures, David said. I have to be honest with you, this wasn't an isolated incident. Our flight attendants are actually trained to prioritize requests from our highest-tier frequent flyers, even if it means asking other passengers to change seats. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're telling me that your company has official policies that allow discrimination against passengers? It's not supposed to be discriminatory, David said defensively. It's supposed to be about customer service for our most valued customers. David, let me ask you something, Marcus said. If my mother had been a young white woman in that seat, do you think your flight attendants would have threatened her with arrest for refusing to move? David was quiet for a long moment. Probably not, he admitted. That admission was all Marcus needed to hear. He realized that Skyline Airlines' problems went much deeper than a few poorly trained employees. They had systemic issues that started at the corporate level and filtered down through their entire organization. David, I'm going to give you 72 hours to come back to me with a comprehensive plan to address these issues, Marcus said. If I don't see real commitment to change, Williams Tech Solutions will be ending our business relationship. After hanging up with David, Marcus called an emergency meeting with his senior management team. He explained the situation and asked for their input on how to proceed. His chief operating officer, Linda Washington, was the first to speak. Marcus, I understand your anger and what happened to your mother was absolutely wrong. But we need to consider the impact on our employees and shareholders. Skyline Airlines represents 12% of our annual revenue. Marcus nodded, acknowledging her concern. Linda, I appreciate the business perspective, but sometimes you have to take a stand regardless of the financial cost. If we ignore this situation, we're essentially endorsing discriminatory practices. His chief financial officer, Robert Kim, added his analysis. Marcus, if we terminate the Skyline contract, we'll need to lay off approximately 300 employees. We also risk damaging our reputation with other airline clients who might see us as unreliable business partners. These were valid concerns, but Marcus had made up his mind. Robert, I'd rather take a short-term financial hit than build our success on partnerships with companies that discriminate against passengers. If other airlines have a problem with us standing up for civil rights, then maybe they're not the kind of clients we want anyway. As the meeting continued, Marcus received another call from his mother. This time, she was calling from Los Angeles International Airport, having successfully completed her flight. Marcus, I wanted you to know that I'm safely in Los Angeles, she said. The rest of the flight was actually quite pleasant. They gave me excellent service, and the captain even came by to check on me personally. Mom, I'm glad the rest of your trip went well, but I'm still moving forward with the legal action, Marcus replied. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about preventing this from happening to other passengers who don't have the resources to fight back. Margaret understood her son's determination, but she also worried about the stress this situation was putting on him. Marcus, honey, you have a good heart, and I'm proud of you for wanting to fight for what's right. But please don't let this consume you. I raised you to be better than the people who hurt us, not to become bitter because of them. Her words reminded Marcus of the lessons she had taught him throughout his childhood. Margaret had always emphasized the importance of standing up for others, especially those who couldn't stand up for themselves. But she had also taught him to fight with dignity and purpose, not just anger. Mom, I promise you that I'm going to handle this the right way, Marcus said. But I'm also going to make sure it leads to real change. As Marcus ended the call with his mother, he realized that the next 72 hours would determine not just the future of his business relationship with Skyline Airlines, but also whether his company's response would inspire other corporations to take a stronger stand against discrimination. He spent the rest of the evening reviewing the evidence his legal team had gathered and preparing for what he knew would be one of the most important business decisions of his career. The consequences of his choice would extend far beyond his company's bottom line. They would send a message to the entire industry about the cost of tolerating discrimination and prejudice. Marcus Williams had built his success on the foundation of his mother's sacrifices and values. Now it was time to prove that those values meant more to him than any amount of money. 72 hours after Marcus Williams gave Skyline Airlines his ultimatum, David Chen called to schedule a meeting. His voice sounded tired and stressed, quite different from the confident CTO Marcus had worked with for the past 3 years. The airline had spent those 3 days in crisis mode, with executives flying in from around the country to address what had quickly become their biggest public relations nightmare in decades. Marcus, our CEO Richard Sterling would like to meet with you personally to discuss this situation, David said. He's prepared to fly to Atlanta tomorrow if you're available. Marcus was surprised by this development. Richard Sterling was known throughout the industry as a tough, no-nonsense businessman who rarely got personally involved in operational issues. The fact that he wanted to meet face-to-face indicated just how seriously Skyline was taking this situation. I'll meet with him, but I want my legal team present, and I want everything on record, Marcus replied. This isn't going to be a casual conversation where everyone shakes hands and pretends nothing happened. While Marcus was preparing for the meeting with Sterling, the story of his mother's treatment had exploded across social media and news outlets. The videos recorded by passengers on the flight had been viewed millions of times, with hashtags like Justice for Mrs. Williams and Skyline Shame trending nationwide. Civil rights organizations had picked up the story and were calling for boycotts of Skyline Airlines. Several celebrities had canceled their flights with the airline and publicly announced they would be flying with competitors instead. The company's stock price had dropped 15% in just 3 days. But the most damaging coverage came from investigative journalists who had begun digging into Skyline's history. They discovered that Margaret Williams' experience was not an isolated incident. Over the past 5 years, the airline had received dozens of complaints from passengers who claimed they had been discriminated against based on their race, age, or appearance. One particularly powerful story involved a young Latino man who had been removed from a first-class seat he had purchased with his own money because a flight attendant claimed his clothing was inappropriate for first class. Another involved an elderly Asian woman who was told she needed to move to accommodate a passenger's service dog, even though airline policy clearly stated that paid passengers couldn't be displaced for such reasons. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Skyline Airlines had a systemic problem with discrimination that went far beyond the training of individual employees. Marcus spent the evening before his meeting with Sterling reviewing all of this evidence with his legal team. What had started as a personal grievance about his mother's treatment had evolved into something much larger. He now understood that he had an opportunity to force real change that could benefit thousands of future passengers. "Marcus, Sterling is going to come in with a big settlement offer for your mother and hope this all goes away quietly," predicted Janet Rodriguez. "He'll probably offer her $1 million, a public apology, and maybe some free flights for life." Marcus shook his head. "He can offer her $10 million, and it won't matter. My mother doesn't need his money, and she definitely doesn't want his pity. What she wants, and what I want, is to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning in the conference room of Marcus's office building. Richard Sterling arrived with an entourage that included David Chen, Skyline's head of legal affairs, their chief human resources officer, and a public relations consultant who had been hired specifically to handle this crisis. Sterling was exactly what Marcus had expected: a tall, silver-haired man in his early 60s who projected confidence and authority. He had been running airlines for 30 years and had survived numerous controversies and challenges. But as he entered the conference room and saw the array of legal documents and evidence that Marcus's team had prepared, his confident expression faltered slightly. "Mr. Williams, I want to begin by offering my personal apology for what happened to your mother," Sterling said as the meeting began. "What she experienced was completely unacceptable and does not represent the values that Skyline Airlines stands for." Marcus listened politely, but wasn't impressed by the prepared statement. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate your apology, but the evidence suggests that what happened to my mother is exactly what Skyline Airlines stands for. Your employees didn't act against company policy. They acted according to training and procedures that prioritize some passengers over others based on arbitrary factors." Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had been hoping to control this meeting, but Marcus was clearly prepared to challenge every statement and assumption. "Mr. Williams, every airline has procedures for managing difficult situations. Sometimes passengers need to be accommodated in different ways to ensure the safety and comfort of all travelers." "Mr. Sterling, are you suggesting that my 72-year-old mother posed a safety threat to other passengers?" Marcus replied. "Because the only difficult situation on that flight was created by your employees when they decided that a white man's sense of entitlement was more important than a black woman's civil rights." The tension in the room was palpable. Sterling's legal team took notes frantically, while Marcus's attorneys watched every reaction and recorded every word. Sterling tried a different approach. "Mr. Williams, we're prepared to offer your mother substantial compensation for this unfortunate incident. We're talking about a 7-figure settlement, along with a public apology and a commitment to additional staff training." Marcus had been expecting this moment. He leaned forward in his chair and looked Sterling directly in the eyes. "Mr. Sterling, my mother worked 3 jobs for most of her adult life to put me through college. She has more dignity and integrity than most people I've met in corporate America. Your money cannot buy back the humiliation she felt when your employees threatened to have her arrested for the crime of sitting in a seat she paid for." Sterling was beginning to realize that this negotiation was unlike any he had handled before. Most lawsuits ended with financial settlements and non-disclosure agreements. But Marcus Williams wasn't interested in money or silence. "What is it that you want, Mr. Williams?" Sterling asked. Marcus stood up and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the conference room. He had prepared for this moment, and he wanted Sterling to understand exactly what real change would require. "I want Skyline Airlines to implement mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees," Marcus began, writing the first point on the board. "Not just a 1-hour online course, but intensive, ongoing training conducted by civil rights organizations." Sterling nodded reluctantly. "That's reasonable. We can implement enhanced training programs. Second, I want you to establish an independent ombudsman's office to investigate discrimination complaints. This office will be funded by Skyline, but operated by an outside organization that reports directly to your board of directors. This demand made Sterling more uncomfortable. Creating an independent oversight office would mean giving up direct control over how discrimination complaints were handled. Third, I want you to establish a $10 million fund to compensate passengers who have been discriminated against by your airline in the past 5 years. This fund will be administered by civil rights organizations, not by Skyline employees. Sterling's legal team immediately began whispering among themselves. A compensation fund of this size would not only cost the airline millions of dollars, but would also represent an admission that discrimination had been a widespread problem. Fourth, I want you to fire every employee who was involved in the incident with my mother, including the flight attendants, the head flight attendant, and any supervisors who approved their actions. This demand struck at the heart of Sterling's authority. Firing multiple employees based on one incident would send shockwaves through the company and could potentially lead to wrongful termination lawsuits. And finally, Marcus continued, I want all of these changes implemented within 90 days, with quarterly progress reports submitted to an independent monitoring organization for the next 3 years. Sterling looked at the list on the whiteboard and then back at Marcus. Mr. Williams, what you're asking for would fundamentally change how our company operates. The cost would be enormous, and the operational challenges would be significant. Marcus returned to his seat and leaned back with the same calm confidence his mother had shown when refusing to give up her seat. Mr. Sterling, the cost of discrimination is always enormous, but it's usually paid by the victims rather than the perpetrators. I'm simply suggesting that it's time for companies like yours to start paying the real price for allowing prejudice and bias to guide your business decisions. Sterling requested a 15-minute recess to consult with his team privately. Marcus used the break to call his mother and update her on the progress of the meeting. Marcus, are you sure all of this is necessary? Margaret asked. It seems like a lot of trouble for people to go through because of what happened to me. Mom, it's not just about what happened to you. It's about what happens to the next elderly black passenger, or the next Latino family, or the next person who doesn't look like what these people think a first-class passenger should look like. When the meeting resumed, Sterling had clearly made a decision. His confident demeanor had been replaced by the resignation of someone who understood that he had no good alternatives. Mr. Williams, we're prepared to accept most of your demands, Sterling said. However, we need more than 90 days to implement all of these changes, and we'd like to discuss the size of the compensation fund. Marcus had expected some negotiation, but he wasn't willing to compromise on the fundamental principles. Mr. Sterling, my mother was given exactly 0 days to adjust to being discriminated against on your airplane. These changes should have been implemented years ago. 90 days is more than generous. The negotiations continued for another 2 hours, with both sides making minor adjustments to timelines and procedures. But Marcus refused to budge on the core demands: real training, independent oversight, meaningful compensation for past victims, accountability for employees who had discriminated against passengers, and ongoing monitoring to ensure lasting change. Finally, Sterling capitulated completely. Mr. Williams, we accept your terms. We'll begin implementing these changes immediately, and we'll provide you with weekly progress reports. But Marcus wasn't finished. Mr. Sterling, there's one more thing. I want you to personally call my mother and apologize to her. Not a statement written by your PR team, but a genuine apology from you to her. Sterling looked surprised by this request, but he nodded in agreement. Of course, I'd be honored to speak with Mrs. Williams. The formal agreement was signed that afternoon, with representatives from civil rights organizations serving as witnesses. The document outlined specific timelines, financial commitments, and oversight procedures that would transform how Skyline Airlines treated its passengers. But the real transformation began the next day, when Richard Sterling called Margaret Williams personally to apologize for her treatment. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, during which Sterling listened as Margaret described not just the incident on the plane, but decades of similar experiences she had faced throughout her life. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that your courage in standing up for yourself has opened our eyes to problems we should have addressed long ago," Sterling said. "Because of you, thousands of future passengers will be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." Margaret was gracious in accepting his apology, but she also made it clear that she expected actions, not just words. "Mr. Sterling, I hope you understand that this isn't about my son's business relationship with your company. This is about basic human decency. Every person who buys a ticket on your airline deserves to be treated fairly, regardless of what they look like or where they come from." Within weeks of the agreement, Skyline Airlines had fired 12 employees who had been involved in discrimination incidents over the past 3 years, including the flight attendants from Margaret's flight. The company also hired a new chief diversity officer and established partnerships with civil rights organizations to develop and implement their new training programs. The compensation fund eventually paid out over $8 million to 47 passengers who had documented experiences of discrimination on Skyline flights. Each case was investigated by an independent review board that included civil rights attorneys and community advocates. Most importantly, the changes at Skyline Airlines inspired other companies in the aviation industry to examine their own policies and procedures. Within 6 months, 3 other major airlines had implemented similar bias training programs and independent oversight mechanisms. Marcus Williams had achieved something that went far beyond protecting his business interests or even seeking justice for his mother. He had used his company's economic leverage to force systemic change that would benefit countless passengers for years to come. 6 months after the incident, Margaret Williams was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony at her son's alma mater, MIT. In her speech, she talked about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to stay quiet. "I learned something important on that airplane," she told the graduating students. "I learned that sometimes the best way to honor the people who sacrificed for you is to make sure that future generations don't have to face the same struggles. My son could have solved my problem with money or influence, but instead he chose to solve the problem for everyone." The standing ovation that followed her speech lasted 5 minutes, with students, faculty, and parents all recognizing that they had witnessed something rare, a story about how individual courage and collective action could create lasting change. As for Marcus Williams, he continued to build his technology company while also establishing a foundation dedicated to supporting civil rights organizations and fighting discrimination in corporate America. He had learned that success without purpose was meaningless, and that the greatest honor he could give his mother was to use his resources to protect others who might not be able to protect themselves. The incident that began with an elderly black woman refusing to give up her airline seat had evolved into a movement that changed an entire industry. It proved that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is not to fight fire with fire, but to fight prejudice with principle and to turn individual grievances into collective progress.